Thank you so much for joining us today to discuss the Founders Pledge approach to effective climate action and meet with our latest and greatest charity recommendations in the climate space. For those of you I haven't met yet, my name is Anu, and I'm the San Francisco-based research advisor for Founders Pledge. I work with our members to understand their values and goals and match them with the most impactful funding opportunities to meet those goals. But before I joined Founders Pledge, I was a material science and engineering researcher at Caltech and Northwestern, where I focused on high temperature surface chemistry for fuel cells and electrolyzers. So the kinds of tech you need for a more hydrogen friendly energy economy. I also briefly dabbled in fusion reactor design, but that's like a whole different thing. During my time in the lab, I started to understand the roadblocks on the path from scientific discovery to the kinds of cost competitive commercial energy technologies that would be helpful to mitigate the enormous challenge of climate change. And that's part of the reason I came to Founders Pledge, to understand and help tackle these systematic challenges from a different perspective. That's why I'm so excited to introduce you to our incredible speakers today. First, we have one of our internal climate experts, Johannes Akva, who will explain the overall Founders Pledge theory of change in the climate space, and he'll explain why we've created our new climate fund to maximize our members' impact. Next, I'll lead a brief fireside chat with our leaders of our top recommended climate charities, Kirsty Gogan, co-founder of TerraPraxis, Armin Cohen, co-founder and executive director of the Clean Air Task Force, and Aaron Burns, director of policy at Carbon 180. We'll then move into breakout rooms where you'll have a chance to speak directly with the charity reps and each other in a smaller group setting. You'll have 10 minutes in a breakout room with each of our 3 charities for a total of 30 minutes. Finally, we'll come back together to share some exciting news about the launch of our climate fund. A few logistics before we get started. If you could keep your cameras on during the event, that would be great. We'd love for you all to see each other and get to know one another through our cohort events. If you have any questions during Johannes's presentation or the fireside, please drop them in the chat feature in Zoom. We're keeping track and we'll be answering questions throughout our event today. Similarly, if we use any jargon you're not familiar with, let us know in the chat feature in Zoom and we'll clarify. The cohort is meant to be a learning opportunity for members of all different backgrounds and levels of climate expertise. So do let us know if there's anything we can clear up. Speaking of learning journeys, before we dive into the details of our recommendations, I'd like to introduce one of our incredible climate champions, Iggy Forstmeyer, previously co-founder of Personio, to share a little about his personal journey to effective climate action. Iggy, take it away.
Thank you, and hi to everybody. I just take a few minutes to share my journey of basically giving to climate causes and then how I ended up at Founders Pledge. So actually, I've been donating towards the climate cause since 10 years, first out of my salary and then out of my exit proceeds and secondaries at Personio. And for the past 10 years, something has always bothered me, and that was that most of the well-known charities actually, they can't really tell you how much good you're actually doing for the climate per euro donated. So the whole evidence they provide is mostly anecdotal. Some oil tanker was stopped, but did it go on the next day? Some forest was protected, but is it still there 10 years after that? And so that was always bugging me. And so I embarked on this journey of basically online research where I tried to figure out how can I actually make sure that every euro that I give to hopefully a better climate actually has the best possible impact. And as you know, this could be measured, for example, by US dollar per ton of CO2 not emitted or by ton of CO2 removed from the atmosphere. And so I spent a lot of time doing that, and turns out this is actually a phenomenally complex challenge because the whole issue is really politicized. And as you can imagine from media coverage, there's like very partisan opinions about that. It's highly ideological. It's just super hard to suss out what actually works and what doesn't. Luckily, throughout this rather extensive Google search, I also stumbled over the Founders Pledge research on the topic, which wasn't only, in my opinion, pretty profound and diligent, but it was also digestible for the likes of me. And so it was pretty good. And I did spend a lot of time actually reading through what Founders Pledge has published and ending up with the confidence that they probably have one of the best, if not the best, summary of what scientific consent says about climate change and what we can do about it. And that was pretty encouraging because I haven't had that confidence level so far. And so as of today, I actually decided to fully trust their approach in research and allocate all of the funds that I want to donate towards the climate cause, to allocate them based on the Founders Pledge recommendations. So that's just one reason why I joined. The other one is the general strategy of Founders Pledge when it comes to climate giving. And as far as I learned, this is actually based on two core pillars, if you want. So the first one is to focus on organizations that are that do advocacy, which is another word for basically consulting and lobbying policymakers. And why is that good? Because there's already a ton of public funds, taxpayer money, and public money being allocated towards climate causes, but largely it's actually allocated towards ineffective measures, and it's, as I said, highly politicized. And so the idea of advocacy is, if we can consult the people that allocate those funds, we might actually be able to redirect them towards better causes, right? And so there's this huge opportunity that for every euro we give towards effective advocacy charities, there's actually a multitude of euros going to effective climate change, effective climate protection. And I think that's a really promising strategy, and also one that's actually necessary in the light of the urgency of this climate crisis. And then the second pillar of the strategy, which I'm sure Johannes will go into later, is to actually focus on charities that do zero carbon technology and innovation. And why do I think that's actually the best or the only way? It's because we have this global increase in consumption and therefore increase in emissions, also driven by developing countries. And in my opinion, consuming less is just not going to cut it, because in the end we have to get to carbon zero, right? So we can at best slow down by not consuming more, but we cannot solve the problem. And so the only way out of this, given the urgency, in my opinion, is to deploy a lot of bold new technologies that manage to actually turn our economy and our whole system into into zero carbon, right? And there's a lot going into that equation and a lot more that we still have to figure out. But I'm actually happy that Founders Pledge is recommending charities that tackle these bold technological challenges and also dare to take a risk. And so it's basically confidence in their research, a focus on advocacy, and also a focus on technology innovation that summarize brought me to this decision to donate through Founders Pledge. And then to just say a few words about the fund, because now so far I've just been talking about how Founders Pledge does climate giving in general. So why do we need a fund? Well, essentially, I believe the fund can increase the impact per euro donated even more, because why is that? Because if you imagine you give to a climate charity yourself, it's not certain that this exact charity at this exact moment in time actually has the biggest need of funding. And so what a fund can do for you is actually, it can, better than the individual person, decide, is there a window of opportunity somewhere? Is there an organization that's highly effective and in need of funds right now, and they can just handle this optimization along the timeline pretty well for you? And what they also can do through the fund is essentially find a mix between more risky organizations and more certain organizations in terms of their direct impact on climate, so they can actually also manage the risk of any given donation. And finally, well, like any fund also in the capitalist world, it also just takes out the administrative work that you have if you donate directly. And so overall, I believe that donating through the fund will increase the tons of CO2 avoided or removed per euro of donation. And so for me, it's pretty obvious that I'm going to do this. And still, I want to stay close to what's happening, but I made the experience that it's actually very easy to talk to any person at the Founders Pledge research team and actually have full transparency where those funds go. So I'm pretty excited about that opportunity, and will probably do 90 to 100% of my climate donations through the fund going forward.
Thank you so much for that, Iggy. I couldn't have said it better myself. And thank you for being an incredible advocate for Founders Pledge. Next, I'd like to hand things over to my colleague. Thanks. I'm going to hand things over to my colleague Johannes, who's going to tell you a little bit more about kind of the ABC of high impact philanthropy, which distills some of our key learnings and expands a little bit on some of the things that Iggy was talking about. Johannes, I'm going to take it away.
Yes, yeah, thank you, Anu, for the nice introduction, and thanks, Iggy, for doing my job. Can you all see the slides? Well, okay, yeah, so what I'm going to talk to you about is the ABC, what I call the ABC of high impact climate philanthropy. And what this ABC really is kind of, I guess I think about it as kind of the DNA of our climate fund, or the strategy that underlies our climate fund, but also the strategy or the principles that underlie our recommendations. So each of our recommendations, the Clean Air Task Force today represented by Armin Cohen, Carbon 180 today represented by Aaron Burns, Director of Policy at Carbon 180, and Terra Praxis today represented by Kirsty Gogan, founder there. And so all of those recommended charities also kind of exemplify the principles of what we think of as like highly effective in the climate space. So I'm going to talk with you about those three principles, about this ABC, both to introduce kind of our climate strategy, but also kind of in the process of that to talk a bit more about the charities that we're recommending. But you're going to hear a lot more from those charities later on, of course. Yes, and the A in this ABC really stands for audacious advocacy. And that really means advocacy that is focused on improving large-scale societal responses for thought leadership and through policy change, which kind of touches on things that Iggy has already talked about. But I'm going to give you a little bit more of the why and how we get there. And I think it's a bit surprising for a climate change presentation, but I'm actually going to start with the good news here. And that is that the climate challenge really is a crisis that the world has finally awoken to. I think we can see over the last 2 or 3 years, the attention to the issue is larger than it has ever been despite COVID. So in Europe, we have the Green Deal. In the US, we have candidate Biden, who's like running on a platform like a massive climate stimulus bill. So it's really quite an amazing change. And we can also see this in world newspaper coverage on the climate issue, which has been steadily increasing, and kind of the resources that are allocated. So even if you kind of compare this to, let's say, 10 years ago when we had the last economic crisis and we had like climate focused stimulus bills in the US or also in Europe, kind of the magnitude is it's like a whole different level. It's a whole different ballgame. And that kind of enormous societal attention to the issue actually presents an enormous opportunity for impact-focused philanthropists, because all of those resources being spent, it's really valuable that they're spent, really important that they're spent in the best way. And that's really kind of where you can make a huge difference. And this might be a little bit abstract, so I'm just going to make this a lot more concrete with one very concrete example. And that example is 45Q, which is a tax credit incentivizing carbon capture. And carbon capture is one of those technologies, one of these very critical technologies really definitely needs if we have a chance of decarbonizing globally. And yeah, 2 years ago in the United States, 2018, the 45Q tax credit was actually increased to a level that it can actually like meaningfully support the installation of carbon capture and storage plants. And this was kind of the result of a campaign by the Clean Air Task Force, of course, in a large coalition. And yeah, John did a lot of research on that for our 2018 report and analyzed kind of the important role that the Clean Air Task Force played in this, talking to policymakers, et cetera. So the thinking is that it's quite possible that this policy would not have been around or would have been around a lot later, if not for that kind of advocacy. So why is that actually so important? I guess the first thing of this tax credit or that incentivizes carbon capture is that it could save a lot of carbon in the United States. So modeling shows that like by 2030, the effects of this tax credit could mean that you save almost 50 million tons of carbon in the US per year. And now, like, what does it actually mean about the charity or about the charitable intervention, the philanthropic choice here? And let's be really, really conservative to make sure like we're not like exaggerating. So like, let's say, okay, there's a 50% chance that this technology completely fails, that this tax credit exists, but nothing happens. Let's also assume that kind of if Clean Air Task Force had not championed that, like let's say 95% probability that other organizations would have pushed this, which was just like way too conservative. Like it's not true, but it's like just to make as conservative a case as possible. And that's also to say like it would have happened anyway 2 years later. So like, even if we make all of those like extremely conservative assumptions, those assumptions are very much biased against finding that to be effective. You get at something at a cost of reducing a ton of carbon for something like $1.60. And everyone who's kind of thought about buying offsets or reduce emissions otherwise will see that this looks like an incredibly cheap, effective opportunity. And of course, the goal is not to minimize your spending, but kind of to maximize your impact. So it's a high leverage to have a lot of impact. So already looks pretty sweet kind of as a national policy. But that's not really what we're here for, I think, at Founders Pledge when we think about why do we think this is so important. And the main importance here for like this kind of technology policy is really the cost reductions and the global effects that those cost reductions can have. So we can see this here on the graph. What I've did is I applied a very simple learning model, which is kind of quite standard, where you say like with every doubling of cumulative capacity, you have a certain learning rate, and we assume here 10%. For something like solar, it's like 30%. So again, this is quite conservative. And you can see if like all of the innovation happens that, or all of the deployment happens that is kind of stimulated by 45Q as predicted, this would kind of halve the cost of carbon capture and storage by 2030. And that's kind of quite impressive. And of course, the question is like, I mean, ultimately cost reductions are not the goal. The goal is saving emissions. But like, if again, unfortunately, there's not really good modeling for that. So there's not really like credible studies that say like, what happens if we reduce the cost of carbon capture by half? Like, how much does this change? But I think like we can again be very conservative and have a very conservative estimate here. Something like saying, okay, if the costs half by 2030, then that brings us like something like 10% closer to what the average deployment of carbon capture is in scenarios where we're actually managing climate change. So again, this is a very conservative assumption because like 50% cost reduction only leading to like 10% increase in deployment. And we combine this with all of the other kind of very conservative assumptions that I already talked about. And then what we come out with, if we make those, then we had kind of at the cost of per ton of saved carbon, that's something around like 10 cents. So kind of going from $1.60 if just focused on a national to something like 10 cents if we're focused on the global picture. So this is like an enormous multiplier or like enormous impact improvement, because what we're really trying to do is we bend the technology curve going forward, having like an effect for domestic policy on global emissions. And really just, excuse me. So this is really just one example, right? So there are lots of those examples, and I talked a lot about the Clean Air Task Force now, but I mean, similar examples exist for the other charities that we're introducing today. So Carbon 180, which on a cumulative budget of less than $500,000, had some pretty significant successes in terms of getting innovation support for carbon removal, and Terra Praxis, which on essentially 50K of philanthropic budget, almost no budget, still Kirsty Gogan, who's leading it on that budget, kind of became one of the world's leading advocates and analysts of nuclear power. And that, importantly, is said by Michael Lee Bright, who's kind of one of the most world-renowned advocates of renewables, so not kind of the person that you would expect to say something so positive about nuclear. And of course, she's also at the International Energy Agency, Clean Energy Ministerial. So what this really goes to show is that actually with relatively little philanthropic money, you can have like huge impact if you're focusing on audacious advocacy and have effective organizations. And just to really kind of bring this point home or make it clear once more what kind of this chain there is, we're kind of going from advocacy through policy change, which means, yeah, we can leverage policy, much larger budgets than our philanthropic budgets. And the policy change is kind of aimed at driving down cost or otherwise kind of improving technology, so we get these cost reductions. And then what these cost reductions cause is like lots of additional global uptake globally. And so even like that's kind of the theory how from like, or not the theory, like that's kind of the logic. It's not theory because we kind of show it, but that's kind of the logic how you get from like supporting advocacy as a philanthropist to plausible gigaton impact. So that's a really great case, we think, for audacious advocacy. And now I'm going to talk a little bit about the question, because like now I talked about like what should we do, like we should fund audacious advocacy. But what should this audacious advocacy be focused on? That's kind of the B of the ABC. And the answer here, we think, is should be focused on blind spots, on the bottlenecks in the overall conversation. And why is that so? Well, there are a couple of reasons for that, but I mean, at the most basic, for every kind of field, every technology field, every approach, it's usually true that like, well, if no one is there, no one is doing the work that you're doing. So like there's very high additionality. That's kind of the first reason. The second one is that early resources are often like especially impactful. So like the first kind of resources being spent on a field can have an amazing impact. And here to shout out an example from Carbon 180. So Carbon 180 were one of the first in the space of carbon removal and negative emissions, and played a pivotal role in funding a report by the National Academy of Sciences in the United States on carbon removal. And that report has really been a landmark in kind of shaping the perception of that topic, putting that like topic on the map. And that's a kind of an example of an approach or how like very early action can have like huge impact, and would not be possible to have that same impact in a field that's already crowded, say like a field like carbon pricing or a field like solar. And then there's a third point here with the blind spots, which is really because of this challenge, because climate is about going to zero emissions. We cannot ignore the bottlenecks and the blind spots, because all the sectors, even the hard ones, need to be decarbonized pretty soon. So those are kind of the three kind of theoretical reasons. And again, I'm going to illustrate this with our charities. But first, how do we actually find those blind spots and bottlenecks? Now that we know that this is kind of what we should focus on. And we look for them in different ways. The first one is that whenever there's like a big difference between expert opinion, what the technology or an approach should do, and what kind of the policy priorities seem to be. There's a second strategy, which kind of goes around like looking at like what are the ideological or political or economic reasons that there are some solutions that are really important, but that no one is focusing on. And then of course, for the bottlenecks, there are also just solutions for which there are no alternatives, for which like if this technology fails, there's no alternative for this in the puzzle. Those are kind of some pointers on how you find those blind spots and bottlenecks. And yeah, for the Clean Air Task Force, again, it's kind of, I guess, if I describe it, my elevator pitch for the Clean Air Task Force is, if it's neglected and important, Clean Air Task Force will have a program for it. So where this focus on like focusing on technologies that are really important, such like, or hard to decarbonize, you can see this here, like iron and steel and cement, so industry, aviation and shipping, load falling, electricity, all of those areas are areas that are hard to decarbonize, where we make little progress in all of those areas, where a Clean Air Task Force is very engaged, and where this is kind of almost like a principle to focus on those solutions and kind of mainstream them into the broader conversation. And for Carbon 180, it's kind of similar for a different kind of technology. For Carbon 180, it's really about, I mean, as the name says, it's about carbon removal. And what is carbon removal? So you can see here is a chart over time, emissions are going down over time. Like, how should this happen if we have to meet ambitious climate policy targets? And you can see this blue bar, and this blue technology starting about 2030, and then really exploding kind of in the later half of the century, are negative emission or carbon removal technologies or approaches that really suck carbon out of the air. That can be natural solutions such as afforestation, but can also be like high-tech solutions such as direct air capture. So like this is kind of really important technology group, but that until now has been really neglected in public attention. And you can see this here on the right-hand side. So this is from a study, from an independent study recently, Energizing America, on kind of the innovation priorities for the next administration in the US. And the number one priority where budget should be increased the most is carbon dioxide removal. So where budgets should be increased to 100%, because it's just a neglected technology at this point. And yeah, Carbon 180 is kind of the premier advocacy organization that's laser focused on this strategy. So that gives a strong reason to support them, we think. And then it's kind of here is the hardest part. Now I have to talk about nuclear, which is kind of a critical conversation. And I'm not going to read out those quotes. You can look at them later when we send them around. But You see all of those important players, Obama, George Monbiot, very famous environmental writer, Michael Liebreich, who I already mentioned. All of them are kind of mentioning the importance of nuclear. Couple more, Bill Gates, etc. But the truth is still, even today, most environmentalists still oppose nuclear, or if they don't, they just support it very half-heartedly. And I include myself in this here. So like I spent most of my early environmental activism being fiercely anti-nuclear and marching against nuclear. So I'm sympathetic to that. But of course, the opposition to nuclear, for the most part, or actually for all parts, is not for good reasons. But we need advocates that show that. And we think that Tara Praxis and Kirsty Gogan and Eric Ingersoll, in particular, the two founders, are amazing advocates for this technology, and they can really showcase how nuclear can help with so much more than just electricity, so also decarbonizing fuels, industrial heat, etc. So even if you're very optimistic about wind and solar, the role for advanced nuclear in the climate puzzle can be really large and really important. And that's, I think, something, there are many pro-nuclear advocates that are very combative, and something that really stands stands out with Kirsty and Eric, and that's why we recommend them, or one of the reasons we recommend them is that they're very constructive, focusing on the role of climate-driven advocacy for nuclear, not against renewables, but kind of emphasizing the positive role that nuclear can play. And it's also an organization, this is not about neglect of the technology, but kind of about philanthropic neglect, that had difficulty getting funding so far because, well, they're European-based. Most European environmental funders are heavily anti-nuclear. Then American funders, pro-nuclear funders, are kind of reluctant to fund someone in Europe. So they're growth constrained or philanthropically constrained for all the wrong reasons, which is also a reason why we think it's like a really great case to focus and to support them. And yeah, with this, I'm kind of at my C, which just stands for, in the ABC, which stands for coordination and co-funding, which means supporting charities, or the recommended charities or other charities, high impact charities, together through the Founders Pledge Climate Fund. Why should we do that? We're going to talk more about this later, but in principle, coordination through the Climate Fund allows for even higher impact. One of this comes from funding guarantees, which are already mentioned. So we have many of the organizations we focus on are very small. So it really makes a big difference to know that the money will definitely be there. And another important reason, timely opportunities. So I already showed before that there's often policy windows where sometimes effort is much more valuable than other times being able to react to this. And then there are, of course, some other reasons, but I'm not going to bore you with this for now. We're just going to close and kind of bringing home the ABC, the A for audacious advocacy, the B for blind spots and bottlenecks, and the C for coordinated co-funding. And bringing those together, we believe that with the Founders Pledge Climate Fund, we can really offer a value proposition to drive climate impact far beyond what you would usually be able to do with philanthropic money, really like lots of multipliers, and the A, the B, and the C that make this an incredibly impactful opportunity. And with that, I hand over to my colleague, Anu.
Awesome. Thank you, Johannes, for laying that out for us. I want to quickly note, we want to move to speaking with our charities. We had some really great discussion in the chat, and we're going to follow up on those questions for you, so don't worry. And I also wanted to note that Johannes covered a lot of details in his chat, in his talk about specific aspects of what we're looking at funding. And we will be sharing notes and a recording of this event for everyone. So if you want to follow up and delve more into the details, we'll be able to do that as well. Now, I'd like to pivot to hearing directly from our top recommended charities, the Clean Air Task Force, co-founded by Armin Cohen, Carbon 180, where we're joined by their Director of Policy, Aaron Burns, and Terra Praxis, co-founded by Kirsty Gogan, all of whom you've heard a little bit about so far. First off, I'd like to start thinking about how we've all kind of come from different perspectives and backgrounds when it comes to climate, and we're all on these sort of personal trajectories to understand how we can have a meaningful impact in this space. For our speakers, I'd love if you could tell us a little bit about your personal journey and how you landed on topics that are fairly neglected within the broader climate discussion. Maybe Armin, you could start us off. Your organization, Clean Air Task Force, is laser focused on neglected solutions. How did you come around to this way of thinking? Armin?
You said, yeah.
Hey, thanks everyone. Just a little confession to start. I started out as an anti-nuclear lawyer. Like Johannes, my youth was spent in opposing nuclear energy. I then turned around to working for 12 years on energy efficiency, launching some of the largest energy efficiency programs in the world at that time. But when we look back, we said, well, we chopped off maybe 1% in the growth of energy demand, and that wasn't going to be enough. I worked a lot on renewable energy, tried to site wind plants in northern Maine, and found that to be very, very slow going. And I still believe in efficiency and renewables, but personal experience with the difficulty of making a big difference quickly in those technologies led me to do some more analysis at Clean Air Task Force. And the analysis really takes us in this direction, and this has been foreshadowed a little bit already by Johannes, so I'll try not to be repetitive. First of all, it's a massive challenge. You have 30 years to get rid of unabated fossil fuels, but the world's going to grow its energy demand by about 50%. So how do you square that circle? Fact number two, we're not doing very well. 30 years ago, fossil fuels were 80% of the global energy economy. We've spent trillions of dollars on wind and solar, and guess what? The percentage is today, it's still 80%. Solar and wind provide about 3% of global energy. So we've got a long way to go. Fact number three, again, and I know this looks going to come across as a critique of renewables. I support them, but the reality is that as you look at all the studies of how you get to zero carbon quickly, wind and solar have a problem of seasonality. That is a huge need for either storage infrastructure or redundant backup generation that might double the cost of electricity if you decide to do even just the electricity grid on wind and solar. And so we need this something else that was mentioned in Johannes's chart. Fact number four, we've done a lot of analysis on this lately with actually some of Kirsty's colleagues. Renewables are extremely land intensive, 10 to 100 times more land intensive than other forms of energy like nuclear or fossil energy with carbon capture. It's a crowded world, and fitting all that kit in is going to be very difficult just if we restrict ourselves to one set of technologies. I've just talked about electricity. Fact number five is that 75% of global energy is consumed not as electricity, but as liquid or gaseous fuels. And again, even if we could decarbonize the entire electric grid with renewables, it's going to be very difficult to do that remaining 75% entirely. So we need other options. Fact number six, the only example of industrialized nations that have had deep carbon reductions on their power grids are countries that have used significant amounts of nuclear power and or hydroelectric power. You need big stuff that you can build relatively fast to make a difference. We believe there's a similar opportunity to strip carbon out of fossil fuels and get to similar scale. So I guess where all this takes us is that no one knows the future. Maybe we have magic stuff that appears that makes an entirely renewable world possible, but we're focusing on the hedge. What happens if that can't happen? And we think you need more options than just the popular ones that are being discussed. So Anu, to answer your question, it's been a combination of personal experience and analysis, some of which we commissioned, but a lot of which we've actually probably encouraged or leveraged. But there's a lot of work out there that all points you to these kind of neglected complements that we need.
Absolutely. And so you touched a little bit on negative emissions. Aaron, I'm wondering, for you, I know you've had exposure to a wide range of issues in energy, environment, labor, agriculture. Could you tell us a little bit about how you landed at Carbon 180 and negative emissions as a focus area?
Yeah, so I landed on negative emissions specifically because it's neglected but so necessary. So I met Noah, one of our two co-founders, back in 2015. And at the time I worked in the Senate, and I spent a lot of my time, I worked for a member on the Energy Committee. I spent a lot of my time on carbon capture and kind of general carbon management. That was the first time I had worked on direct air capture. And we saw from Johannes's sides, this is something that's absolutely necessary to meet climate goals. This was just 5 years ago. And in the Senate, I worked not just on energy issues, but labor, transportation, public lands, gun control. I worked on a really broad set of things, and it felt really clear to me that the place where there was the most potential for policy impact and the biggest gap in people doing the kind of work that needed to be done was around negative emissions. And so I continued to work with Carbon 180 as I kind of shifted around to different places. And what ultimately brought me to the organization specifically to do this work was that it was one of the only places I saw that had the technical expertise, the connections to innovators and on the ground practitioners, and being a smaller organization, that kind of agility to make sure that we're creating science-driven, durable policies that are going to actually result in scaling carbon removal, that aren't just, something that we can feel good about. That we tried really hard, but they're actually going to have those real-world impacts. And I think for me, that's really about, when you're trying to create great policy, you don't just need policy expertise. You need to work day to day with experts and entrepreneurs in the field. And for us, there's really that constant feedback loop of understanding what entrepreneurs need, how farmers and ranchers are thinking about carbon removal practices. We talked a lot about the technical side, but we also work on natural carbon removal solutions, of learning where researchers and scientists see breakthrough potential. And we're able to use that feedback to create policies that are going to result in real measurable impacts. I think a good example of that is the appropriations and R&D funding work that we've been able to do. That process for us, I think, is really indicative of the kind of work that we do. So, for example, when we come up with those numbers, we have to first figure out, what are the needs in this space? What are the funding needs in this space? And that requires talking to a lot of people and getting a lot of feedback. But it also requires the policy expertise, the ability to know how the appropriations process works. It's a really nitty-gritty process that isn't a particularly transparent thing that, not a lot of folks have, deep expertise in. And it requires a lot of connections in the policy space and the coalition building and a lot of those advocacy tools that made things like 45Q successful. And so being able to combine all of those things, that those kinds of connections and deep technical expertise, the policy and advocacy expertise, was really what drew me to Carbon 180. And I think has allowed us to be so successful in just a couple of years. We started our dedicated policy shop a couple of years ago, but to be so successful in those pieces in just a couple of years.
Absolutely. And we're going to dig into the policy aspects a little bit more later. But first, Kirsty, I'd love to hear a little bit about your personal journey as well, especially working in an area like nuclear that can evoke some pretty strong emotions and opinions.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I mean, if you told me like 10 years ago that I'd be advocating for nuclear energy, I wouldn't have believed you. I've spent my whole career working in the environment, sustainability, and then of course that's been increasingly overtaken by climate change until we're all consumed by climate change. But it was only when I was given a copy of Professor Sir David Mackay's book, Sustainable Energy Without the Hot Air, as a wedding present, that I started to look again at nuclear. I was by default really anti-nuclear as an environmentalist. And that book, I really recommend it. It crunches through the numbers about how the UK at the time could achieve its 80% carbon reduction commitments by mid-century using existing technology. And there was two real key insights from reading that book. Firstly, doing it just with renewables, getting all the way there was going to be incredibly difficult, just politically and from a public acceptability perspective, infeasible in terms of the land that would be required. It's like, okay, if we're prepared to use all of our available agricultural land and surround the entire country and with wind turbines and so on, maybe, but it's not even a question of whether it's technically feasible, it's really a question of whether it is feasible. So that was the first insight. So like, oh, okay, maybe we can't do it all with renewables. And the second was actually that almost everything I thought that I knew about nuclear was wrong. It was based on misinformation and bad propaganda. And so I started to look into it. And at the time, I was asked to work, invited to interview for a job at the Department for Energy and Climate Change. And I was like, okay, yep, that's great. That's right up my street. So I was looking for a consulting job after having had a baby. And they said, oh, but there's a catch. It's in the nuclear division. I was like, oh, crikey, and it was to run the national public consultation for new build. And I thought, well, you know, if I do this job, I'll do it with real integrity, and I'll like really bring the green NGOs in. And I was, at the time, I was unreconstructed. So I did run the public consultations, incredibly successful. We built a huge amount of trust and relationships with the green NGOs. And that was the beginning of my journey. I went off and had another baby, and then Fukushima happened. And they called me back, government phoned me up, and they said, can you come and like evaluate our response to what, you know, how we, government, blue light services, industry, local government, everyone who had some kind of role in responding to the accident at Fukushima. And so I came back in, and the first thing that I did was read all of the Public Health Organization and United Nations reports on what happened last time. And this was another sort of important milestone in realizing that actually, although I had sort of somehow thought that maybe 1 million people had died as a result of Chernobyl, in fact, the biggest public health impact from that accident had been fear of radiation. And actually the response. So obviously I could speak at length about these various realizations that I had on my journey, but it is a journey. And it actually, you know, it culminated in my realizing that there were very few at the time civil society-based organizations making the humanitarian and environmental case for nuclear energy, and that in light of climate change, in light of the scale and the urgency, and you know, Armand described extremely well, like many of these same insights that have also inspired me around the fact that, you know, here we are 30 years after successfully building public and political support for action on climate change, and we haven't made a dent in the upward trajectory of emissions. In fact, half of the emissions that are in the atmosphere today have been emitted in the past 30 years. And now we have another 30 years to turn the tanker. And, you know, my daughter will be the age that I am now in 30 years' time. So really this deadline is coming into sharp relief. And therefore, you know, yes, we've done extremely well at driving down the costs and increasing the rates of deployment for certain technologies. Now we need to apply that success template to the other technologies, and also to pay, you know, to turn our attention beyond the power sector to that other 75% of energy use outside electricity, for which we really don't have good answers right now. And that's what our sort of mission is really with TerraPraxis. It's going after the other sort of 80% of hard to abate energy consumption.
Absolutely. And there's a lot that I hope we'll get into more in our breakout sessions, but I just want to say that is quite the wedding gift that changed the course of your trajectory in working on nuclear.
I'm very grateful to my husband's aunt, I have to say.
Now I'd like to shift gears and focus a little bit more on the work that your organizations do specifically, and framed around our main call to action today with the Climate Fund, if that's okay. Erin, maybe we can start with you. One of the reasons we're excited about the fund is the ability to support time-sensitive funding opportunities. And, you know, at Carbon 180, you're focusing a lot on federal policy. Can you speak a little bit about the time-sensitive nature of policy windows? How quickly do these opportunities open and close? And how can you maximize your impact when an opportunity appears?
Yeah, absolutely. So in US federal policy where we work, you really see waves of momentum and support for action on particular topics. And then when those particular efforts succeed or fail, the momentum dissipates and Congress focuses elsewhere. Today, we're really at a point where there's growing momentum for climate action. And we're really at an inflection point for carbon removal policy in particular. So there's increasing awareness that you need carbon removal to be a significant piece of any climate action. You know, the ramp up in federal R&D was a good example. All major climate legislation that we've seen out of Congress and all major climate reports out of Congress include carbon removal. The Biden campaign, the Biden-Sanders Unity Task Force, the Green New Deal all include carbon removal. Unlike other climate solutions, though, carbon removal technologies and those policies to scale them up are nascent, and there really aren't enough people working on them. And so we were actually talking yesterday internally. We're the only organization I know of in the US focused entirely on these technologies and practices. And in fact, I would say most organizations don't. I think there are very few people who even just their entire, you know, as a single person at an organization, that their entire job is focused on carbon removal. And so when we're thinking about taking advantage of this window, of this momentum for not just climate action broadly, but of, you know, scaling carbon removal, we we're a little under-resourced as a field. ClimateWorks released a report recently on philanthropy. Less than 2% of philanthropy goes to climate change, and less than 2% of that climate foundation giving goes to carbon removal. And so you're not going to get carbon removal at scale without robust federal policy, and you're not going to get that federal policy without people working full-time on developing and advocating for the policies. And you're not going to get those policy people without support from funders. And so right now we are at that point where we have that wave of momentum growing. You know, there's a kind of clear bipartisan consensus in the US that we're going to need to do something on climate. And that this is not just a necessity, but a political opportunity, which frankly is important when you're talking about getting politicians on board with doing something major. And at this moment is when we need to be ready, you know, over the next year, 2, 3 years, to have those, to take advantage of that momentum, to have those policies ready to go, to have those advocacy campaigns ready to move, and being able to take advantage of that interest and momentum in the past. You know, the National Academies report was one example that really, you know, we helped fund, raise money for the National Academies report. That came out and provided a kind of R&D pathway. And then we took advantage of that through an appropriations advocacy campaign that has resulted in going from less than $11 million total historically, total historic funding for R&D on direct air capture in the US to $68 million for negative emissions technologies in the previous appropriations bill. So being able to identify those opportunities to take advantage of those kind of relatively short policy windows is really necessary when we're talking about scaling this up in time, because as Kirsty mentioned, like, you know, I also have a daughter. I have a 4-month-old, and in 2050 she won't even be as old as I am now. And so I think it's really helpful to realize that we do have a very short window to take advantage of these and to get these technologies deployed.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. We also were excited with the fund. We have the opportunity to provide funding guarantees for newer, younger charities that don't have existing funding streams as they get off the ground. Kirsty, if we could throw it back to you. You've been working on energy policy for over 20 years, but you just launched this new nonprofit, Terra Praxis, to change people's minds about nuclear power. What are some of the challenges and opportunities you see as a new, smaller charity in the climate space, particularly in the nuclear space?
Yeah, I mean, although the organization is new, I think I'm pretty fortunate to have an incredible network, a support network, and you know, we partner with many organizations, including our colleagues here, Armand and Erin, and you know, there's a huge amount of goodwill, I think, between all of our organizations. So although we're new, I'm not too worried about that. I think the challenge is really, you know, the extent of funding that already exists for other technologies, and it's really about sort of shifting some of the attention, some of the effort and resource to other options, and that's something that we're really focused on for COP26. You know, I've been going to COP20 to the climate conferences each year now since 2015, when I brought 4 of the world's most kind of eminent climate scientists to COP21 in Paris. And it was the first time, incredibly, that those climate scientists, including James Hansen, had ever been to a climate conference. And it attracted a lot of attention, not only because they were there, but also because they actually said, look, we need to include all of our low carbon tools, given the scale and urgency of climate change, including nuclear. We had media from that press conference that reached apparently around 800 million people. So, you know, the messenger is as important as the message in many cases. But for COP26, you know, I want to raise the bar again and see nuclear really stepping up, being represented appropriately for the contribution that it already makes in many countries to carbon mitigation whilst enabling economic growth and clean air, but also for the potential that it could really help in terms of the 50% of carbon reduction that's needed in those other sectors, where all of the mainstream projections indicate that we will get around 50% of the way to decarbonisation by mid-century. And it's time now for the global community to start thinking about the other 50% within this 30 years that we have left to really do something meaningful about this challenge.
Definitely. And it seems like both hearing from Erin and Kirsty, there's a really time-sensitive component to this work that just needs to happen as quickly as possible. I also want to make a quick note for our audience. We're covering a lot of information and referencing specific reports and activities, and we'll be able to follow up with that info. So if it's coming kind of fast and furious, don't worry.
Yeah, I just say that it's really critical that, we're, that doesn't mean we're lobbying for the industry, and that, we're incredibly critical of the nuclear industry. In fact, my colleague Eric, who's making a joke that there's only one thing that the industry fears more than being on a panel with Greenpeace, and that's being on a panel with me, which is quite funny, but it's because actually what a big piece of our work is showing how the industry has to transform, how it has to step up. And frankly, we haven't seen the nuclear industry really prepared to do that, really be prepared to commit to the extent of cost reduction that's needed, to commit to the much broader value proposition outside the power sector to other sectors like making hydrogen, for example, and heat, and really demonstrating the innovation that will be required to achieve that cost effectively and at scale. So, I just want to be super, super clear that this really isn't about industry advocacy at all. Quite the opposite. I'm not really even sure that the industry in its current state is going to be ready to deliver. So a big piece of this is going to be about bringing other sectors through, and a big part of our advocacy is going to be about engaging with really successful industries like the shipbuilding industry, for example, that already delivers highly regulated, really complex machinery at the kind of climate scale that we need.
Absolutely, and that's a really helpful clarification. Before we move to our breakouts, I'd love to hear from you, Armand, a little bit. Another benefit of the fund that we're excited about is the ability to add a degree of predictability and remove uncertainty when supporting organizations that we know are doing really great work. Armand, you've worked with Founders Pledge for a couple of years now, since our 2018 climate report. Could you tell us a little bit about how Clean Air Task Force work has evolved in the last couple of years and what you're looking forward to in the next couple of years?
Yeah, so first of all, let me say that the Founders Pledge support has just shot us up into an entirely different league. I guess in contrast to Kirsty's and Erin's organization, we're kind of middle-aged. We're 25 years old. We've been around for a while. We're still kind of a startup, though. We're still pretty small. We're in the sort of $9 to $10 million a year range. If you look at other large environmental NGOs like Natural Resources Defense Council or Environmental Defense Fund, they've got budgets of 200, 300 million a year. So we're still minnows in the sea. I think very effective minnows, punching way above our weight, to mix metaphors there. I don't think minnows punch, but anyway. But the value, our work has really progressed from sort of being focused on very particular demonstration prototype activities in the United States and thinking much more globally. We opened an office in the EU just this summer to kind of spread some of the thinking, this multi-technology thinking in the European Union, where it's even less, I guess, well embraced by the environmental community than in the United States. So we see increasingly our work moving globally, and the Founders Pledge has really enabled us to do that. Almost overnight, as soon as that recommendation went on the website, we immediately began to get queries from donors, which is the opposite of the way it usually works, right? Where we have to go out and seek donors out. Some of those donors are on this call. It's been incredibly helpful. I would say directly or indirectly, either through Founder Pledge donors or people who read about us on the Founder Pledge site, our budget is up 30% from 2 years ago. That's huge. And because it tends to be, it's all unrestricted money, it's the most valuable money we have because it's the working capital for all the innovative thinking. Typically, most of our support came from philanthropic foundations, which were not only tepid to oppose to what we were doing on some of these advanced technology areas, but we were restricted to particular projects. So this kind of unrestricted money that allows us to kind of think, and develop new ideas, go out and try things is just, 5 times more valuable than the core money. So there's a perfect alignment here. Just as we were getting ready to really, expand our work geographically, Founders Pledge came along. The one other thing I wouldn't downplay is that Founder Pledge members are not only important for money, but you're people who actually have influence in the world. You go around and your legitimation of these more analytically based technology inclusive strategies is incredibly valuable in the circles you travel in. While we certainly welcome the funding, the intellectual capital here needs to spread, and you all operate in worlds where people make a difference and people matter. So I would say it's been 2 things, Anu. It's been, clearly the funding has made a huge difference to support our expanded ambition. And secondly, the platform for the ideas has been extremely valuable as well.
Broad range of topics, and I personally have a lot of follow-up questions in mind, but I want to get us into the breakout rooms and keep the discussion from the chat going and get everyone else involved as well. Hi everyone, welcome back. I hope you enjoyed the breakout session. If you have any unasked, unanswered questions, please drop them in the chat in Zoom and we'll make sure to follow up. And you can also add them to your feedback form after this event. I want to quickly wrap things up and reiterate why we've launched the fund, and exciting announcement that you can see our climate fund is launching with a $500,000 matching opportunity from an anonymous donor. We're really fortunate that this donor, when they went through their kind of learning process about how to be impactful in the climate space, it led them to Founders Pledge, and they're joining us in this exciting work that you've heard about today from our top charities. And I just want to quickly reiterate a couple of the points and why we're excited about the fund. We're excited to have this pooling donation because it allows us to make larger coordinated grants. This in turn allows us to think long-term and take actions for the charities to think long-term and take actions like hiring new researchers and starting a new program. One thing that we didn't touch on earlier, but I want to point out, is that we think the fund is a great option for donors because it's convenient and easy to use. The fund sits with Founders Pledge, which has registered charities in the US, UK, and Germany. We can accept donations directly from members and from donor advised funds, including, of course, staff accounts that are held with us. Moreover, we have the infrastructure for global grant making. So if you've already committed to giving to climate causes, this is an easy way to act on that commitment. We're really excited to have you in our cohort, and a special thank you to our climate champion, Iggy, and to our speakers, Armin, Kirsty, and Aaron. Thank you for sharing your insights, and most importantly, thank you for doing the work that you do. That's all for me. Have a great rest of your day, everyone. Thanks.